Я бы тоже.
Dedicated attendees. What do you notice about the title slide today that is in contrast to the last two? There are two dollars, exactly. Which means we are starting to develop somewhere. This is the keenly searching for ways and means. Today we get a bit more into methodology and possible ways to deal with. Well, I don't know. My intention was that in the first lecture we say, look at this, it's very interesting. And in the second lecture I complained a bit. Does that seem about right? Lecture 1, everyone should work on this. Lecture 2, because really we need to do better than what we do. Lecture 3, here are some suggestions for where we might be able to be going. This time we're addressing the question of how the language families change, in a sense. How do processes for getting bigger, and we're focusing on the linguistics of it. The idea is, can we use our linguistic data to try to answer the questions of what happened when languages arrived in areas? Keeping in mind that there are only 2 known cases in the world where languages, the modern languages that we observe, reflect the first human occupation of that area. Only one case where it's certain and another case where it's maybe. So generally we're not dealing with that. We've already talked about the fact that you can explain similarities and differences between languages through descent, through contact, through universal trends or random chance, and we've seen that diagram and that. So let's start talking about the actual social processes that might be involved. Who here was in Patty Epps's talk yesterday when she discussed contact in Amazon? Okay, so you are likely to be disappointed in today because that I think was as masterful as it gets. But here's another perspective. Let's imagine a scenario with a group of people. And they're happily living off on the left-hand side of the screen when, over time, more humans arrive. Nervous at first, they slowly start moving closer and closer until they get within speaking distance. At which point someone says, I need a volunteer from the audience here. One volunteer.
Hello.
But you don't diacritics, right? This is to show that they have an accent. Hence the new people, not quite understanding, reply with their own set of diacritics. Pardon. Perhaps, I don't know what these diacritics mean. Who knows?
Inspector Clouseau speaks French, English this way.
So quite possibly this is a British person putting on an outrageous French accent. Who knows? Now at this point, our red people who've just arrived have options. Option 1 is, you see what they did there? They changed their diacritics, so really what they did was adapt to their language slightly. This could be the very beginning of language contact effect. We just, you didn't understand my outrageous accent one, so I either increase it or turn it down. This is a possibility. How do we decide whether that happens or not? Not so much decide. How do we evaluate whether this will happen or not? And this comes back to what language is. Clearly, the red people want to talk to the blue people. How determined are they to communicate? Is language a really strong marker of identity? Or is language seen as a tool to communicate with people? Yesterday, Patty gave the example of sitting in a canoe, and as it drifted backwards, she was approaching a branch, which would hit her on the head. And the other person in the canoe was so determined to stick to one language, which she knew Patty could not speak, that she would only warn Patty of the incoming branch in that language. Despite them sharing a common language, this woman would not speak in the common language, because language was an identity marker at a high level. So, what other options can we come up with? It might be, right at the beginning, our red people, at least one of them, speaks blue. This is also a language contact event, because no matter how well those red people speak blue, those red people have some hint of an accent in there. It might be that red people come in and say, thank you, which evokes a, oh, recognize that language, and this person replies back. All of these are at a really basic level, and losing all the complexity that comes over years. This is language contact in action. How do people negotiate with each other? Nick Enfield has expressed it very nicely, where speaking of mainland Southeast Asia, he writes that this kind of adaptation, this kind of making communication simple, should not surprise any of us. The surprising part is when that doesn't happen. How is it that the world isn't one giant linguistic area, since everyone talks to their neighbours pretty much? So surely, the argument goes, surely all the way from Portugal to the Bering Strait, people should have levelled out differences to make things easier. Clearly that didn't happen. Luckily, that didn't happen. Lots of factors will come in to determining the variables in who says what to who. There's a whole lot of variables which we can juggle, and many people have discussed these kinds of variables. The ones in red are the only ones that are actually straight structural linguistic. Now this is really unfortunate when we consider us trying to understand a large part of the world, or even a small part of the world, over a long time. If I want to know what's going on in Dagestan with contacts with Russian and other Dagestani languages right now, we can go and observe, and probably get complicated data that will make some sense of it. If I want to understand what language contact was in Dagestan or anywhere else 500 years ago, if I'm lucky, there might be a historical source saying, oh, the natives of this village speak with an outrageous accent, and then it's up to me to try and interpret that. Most likely, all I have is the modern data. So of all these factors that will affect how language contact goes, who speaks what sort of accent, and over time, as the contact increases, what effect one language has on the other. Of all these factors, and we could list more, the only one we have access to for a lot of the world is this last one. If we have linguistic data, we can try and work out if something has gone on in the past. All the rest, we would love to have the data on. And that involves either doing some good social linguistics or traveling back in time to see what happened. So, the prestige option is going to clearly determine a lot. This is me getting to, if we only have language data, what can we infer from it? So, prestige will have a big role in determining which language is spoken. In other words, if right now we observe this language is spoken in a village, or an area of villages, then that language must have been prestigious enough to survive. A language with no prestige is not data we will have. It doesn't have to be widespread prestige, but there has to be prestige perceived by somebody for a language to continue to be spoken. I'm assuming, which I think is valid, that the natural state of the world is multilingual. And so almost all human societies will have a choice of codes they can speak in. Which means if of the codes they can speak, one is massively devalued, it will disappear. And if that happened 1,000 years ago, we don't know it exists. Or we may have just hints of substratal data, but we have little information. Indigeneity has to count for something. If those blue people are the original inhabitants of this screen, and those red people just appeared maybe from the other lecture room, they came from that direction.
I beg your pardon, there is some problem with the right part of the screen. Probably.
There's an S missing.
Yeah, something could be.
Yeah, there could be a war going on there, or maybe it's just boring. Who knows? Our point though is these blue people are indigenous to this room. They know where the controls are for the curtains. The fact that they're the same there doesn't matter. They have specialist knowledge. Being indigenous to an area gives whatever language and culture is spoken there some advantage. If we have somebody arriving, if I go out into that forest, not a single tree is familiar to me. I have tested this. I can't name anything there. I know nothing of the flora and fauna of this part of the world. So going out on my own, I will have a very impoverished experience because I just say, oh, it's trees. And it will be the reverse if you come to my town. Being indigenous gives you knowledge. Having knowledge is valuable. Those people will value some of that knowledge. The demography, of course, has a huge role. If simply a small group of people arrive and settle in this area, they are, if everything else is equal, less likely to have a big impact on linguistics. Majorities tend to win out if everything else is equal. If they come bearing, I don't know, what technology do they have in that room that we don't have in this room?
I guess they're the same.
No, but we have to invent something.
Maybe a laptop.
They have a laptop there which is better than this laptop. Sorry, laptop. So if they have better technology, better skills, maybe they have more influence. We don't know. But everything else being equal, more people means more chance of surviving. I don't think anyone would really dispute that. So let's construct a possible scenario of what might be happening. With the intruder, the group that's not indigenous, there are very many of them, and they bring a prestige language compared to a low prestige local language. We might see a situation where those locals are just sitting around minding their own business, when this time coming from the other side, we see a much larger linguistic group arrive. And over time, the initial point of contact, when those blue people need to learn how to live in this red environment, there'll be language contact effects from red to blue. On a small level, there's enough of these blue people that they will not be adapting very much, but there's some knowledge they have to learn. And could someone name one of the tree species out there for me?
Birch.
This is not a word for a tree in my country, so I will learn this word. Thank you. 20 years ago I was in Canada and I learned the word cedar hedge. It's a thing that doesn't exist in my country. It's when you mark the boundary between two properties by planting a row of cedar trees. This isn't a thing. My variety of English does not have post-vocalic R's, so the word cedar is pronounced as cedar. But I have learnt this one word as cedar hedge, because it's the only context I've ever seen it in, is in Canadian gardens. Tiny bit of influence. But then, really, over time, we're going to see more and more of those blue people having an effect on the original red population, and it will increase and increase and increase. And we will slowly but inevitably, I think, given a populous, newly arrived group with a prestigious language and a low prestige minority group, we're not going to see that minority language survive. You'll notice even their earlier influence on the arriving population vanished over time. So we can look at how many people there are, we can look at the demography, but recall, we can't look at that 1,000 years ago. We have to come up with a typology of what linguistic effects are observed from different linguistic contact situations. And from those, we can maybe hopefully infer that there were less red people at some point in the past. Talbot has put together a nice model of showing how languages change from generation to generation, and he very astutely points out that it's not all parents to children. There's also children to children effects. Prestigious children will affect other children's speech. There have been some lovely studies in Australia recently showing that communities which maintain indigenous languages can be maintaining them quite well, and then it takes one cool kid to decide to switch to English and bang, the whole school goes. But a point that we need to make, I think, since this is aeriality and aeriality is contact and contact is multilingualism, is we also need to consider the outsiders. And when those two other circles of humans arrive, on my screen there's 2 complete circles. On my screen there's also 3 of them, but you'll have to just accept that the very right edge is gone. If those new arrivals are few in number but speak a highly prestigious language, which might mean what? What could make a language prestigious in a community? Well, we've got a smaller number of people, so it can't be number of native speakers.
Maybe this is a cultural language, or a religion also.
It could be cultural, it could be a language of wider communication, it could be useful for trade, it might be the language in which particular cultural events are embedded, lots of reasons. Those parents will spread their language to their children, and those parents will have influence on other people's children who aspire to be that dominant, and the children will have an effect on the other children they interact with. We have complex situations. So what goes on when we have our multilingual society? In our multilingual society, at some point we're hoping that one red person and one blue person come a little bit closer to each other, romance blossoms, and eventually, perhaps, they even have a child who you'll note is conveniently purple, and a perfect blend of red and blue. In this situation, all else being equal, the mother is likely to spend more time with the child, and the child is going to hear the mother more. Regardless of what language the mother is speaking, the mother's phonology is going to have the biggest input to the child. The mother may be adapting, assuming these red people have come to live with these blue people, the mother may be adapting to the blue language, but as an adult learner of the language, the mother will not be perfectly adapting to the blue language. And so we will see red phonological traits present in our purple child.
Is it just an assumption, or were there studies done?
There are studies of migrant children and the reason why accents from different countries preserve through a couple of generations. So you'll find that parents arrive in country, they have accents because they're adult speakers, but the children born to the parents retain a non-standard accent.
So it's really personal help, blue help, right?
Yeah, exactly. And if it's split down the middle perfectly, which it won't, then the red half is probably more of the phonology, and the blue half, assuming we're living in this community that speaks a blue language, the blue half will be the lexicon and the morphosyntax, roughly. Thomason and Kaufman came up with a typology of what goes on under a scale of 1 to 5 of language contact. And really we're interested in that bottom part. The part where, again, we could observe this typologically. We can observe this even after lexical replacement has gone on. I think I've pointed out enough times that I don't find that much value in the lexicon. We've seen enough examples of it getting replaced left, right, and centre that I don't trust it much. Don't trust the rest very much either, but it's what we've got. Another crude typology I proposed 5 years ago, based on a number of case studies, but rather than examine it in detail, which we can do more of tomorrow, let's see what kind of data we can be looking at. The phonology isn't the morphology, isn't the syntax, isn't the discourse, isn't the lexicon. We know that these are differentially affected in contact situations. We know that in an ideal world, the way nominal morphology works, the way verbal morphology works, often shows a big disparity. We have beautiful examples of languages like Michif, where the verbs show an Algonquian source, the noun phrases show a French source. the lexicon shows about 50-50-ish. We could split this up an awful lot, but for the sake of simple presentation, I won't right now. We have to question from the linguistic data we have. So I'm again imagining my 1,000 years ago, was there a contact event here? Why would we suspect that? This is lexical data, that data I suspect so much, from some languages in Nepal. The Tamanic languages are in blue, and the Tibetan languages are in red. This lexical data is 239 lexemes coded for nested cognacy, or rather nested plausible cognacy. And after throwing them into split tree, they stick out like this. Assuming you don't know which language is which, these ones are all the Tibetan languages. These ones are all the Tamanic languages, and Chantel has fallen off the screen, I apologize. There's one more down there. In other words, these languages separate out rather beautifully on the basis of lexicon. The problem is, and you can't even see it, Chantel down there is not typical. It is not behaving in a little tight cluster with the rest of the Tamanic languages. It has just appeared far away. If I look at just the Tamanic languages, once more, you see Chantel down here. I apologize for using too much slide space. Chantel is quite distinct from the others. We can't explain, from the perspective of the Tamanic languages, we can't explain why Chantel is so lexically aberrant. But then if we throw Nepali in as well, what conclusions can we draw from this data? Nepali is not related to these languages, but it is a dominant language of Nepal.
There was contact.
There was contact, and Chantel has a lexicon that is quite divergent from the other languages that it's related to as a result of being dragged towards Nepali. Something like 40 to 50% of the basic vocabulary of Chantel is Nepali origin. Even before we added Nepali in, we could see by the fact that Chantel was so far away that something has happened. This idea that I brought up on Tuesday, that there's range of variation in which we're not suspicious. If we have a proto-language, the language is developed, some head there, and we're not that surprised because languages change. But if a language jumps over there, that's too far. Something went on there. And Chantel went too far. And even before we added the Nepali in, we could tell that it is not behaving, it is not showing the level of divergence that we expect for this family. The distance between Gurung and Tamang and Seken, Takali and Manange, that distance is what we expect for lexical divergence in this subgroup. And then there's Chantel, which has diverged way too much. We have grounds for suspecting a contact event. At this point, we don't have a contact event, but luckily, we still have access to this data. And now we can say, all right, we have an Indo-Aryan contact event on these Tibeto-Burman languages. So the idea of what's a normal path of development is something we can objectively assess. The idea of how much change is too much isn't just guessing. We can make some sense of it. We can also detect, this is the important bit, that's Chantel there on the far edge, and Nepali came into Nepal from the west, so it was the first one contacted. This was lexical data, basic word list. This is what happens if I look at the morphosyntax of the languages. There's Chantel. Chantel is one of the Tamanic languages. All the Tamanic languages are kind of on the same side. It's a little bit off, but it's not close to Nepali. Chantel morphosyntax is not showing significant Nepali influence. Chantel is not as close as Seke, Menange and Takali, which are all geographically quite close. Gurung and Tamang, which are in the lowlands, close. But it's not way, way off. It's closer to Hlomi, Plomi being one of the Tibetan languages in this sample. But do you think Plomi is showing a typical Tibetan morphosyntax? It looks like not. It looks like Tibetan should be up there. Let's say Hasa Tibetan is written Tibetan, Nubri Tsum and Hirom in northern Nepal, Yolmo and Jirel in northern Nepal as well. Plomi isn't, nor for that matter Sherpa. Sherpa is looking a lot like a lowland language morphosyntactically. Lexically, beautiful, perfect Tibetan language. Morphosyntactically, Sherpa, which has had extensive contact into the lowlands of Nepal for many centuries, has adapted. And where Sherpa comes into Nepal is just about at the eastern edge of the Tamang range. Plomi, I just constructed a contact scenario for Sherpa for you. We're assuming that that's where Tibetan morphosyntax is. This is where Tamangic morphosyntax is. I explained about Sherpa. You tell me about Plomi. What can you infer about Plomi from this diagram? Something's gone on to affect its morphosyntax more than it should have been affected. It's a Tibetan language. It should be on the Tibetan side of the map. It's not. What kind of event do you think happened?
Maybe it is also close geographically to Chantal.
Actually, these are the most distant of the languages here. But it's closest socially to what happened there. The Plomi too have moved down into the lowlands. They haven't moved into the lowlands occupied by the Tamangic people, but they have similarly been influenced by lowland syntax, just a different kind of syntax to this. The Plomi are far to the east. You can see Nepali is not a really big force in driving the morphosyntax of any of these languages, except maybe Jirel. Jirel also has extended further south and is more in that lowland area and has more contact with Nepali. What we saw in the lexicon showed Chontel and Nepali grouping together. And then we had the rest of Tamangic and all of Tibetan. What we see when we look at the morphosyntax shows Sherpa as completely assimilated, Plomi as going off in another direction, and at this point we don't have data from the languages close to Plomi, so we can't examine possible contact there. In the real world we do, but we don't on this screen. And there's Nepali, which has dragged Jirel into its circle. Not very close, but it's dragged it in that direction. So we can, in the absence of studies of prestige, dominance, local knowledge, indigenous knowledge, we can start to suspect contact situations just based on the linguistic data. The linguistic data from any group of languages inherently has an aerial signal. That doesn't mean that languages from this half of the room and this half of the room are necessarily the same and different. It means that in the information, in the structure of the language, there is a signal which may tell us about similarities, it may tell us about differences, but it tells us something about the history of that language with respect to others. Not necessarily something we can interpret easily, but it tells us something. Here's another study of morphosyntax, but now I've moved back to the edge of the Pacific. These are Chinese languages, classified according to 280, 290 morphosyntactic features. Who here is familiar with lots of Chinese place names? Okay, one, two. I will be kinder. These languages are all varieties of Mandarin according to Chinese classification. These ones are Cantonese varieties. Of the Cantonese ones, where do you think the center of gravity of Cantonese is? The red, where do you think red belongs? That doesn't belong anywhere, obviously.
Where the Shan is.
Yeah, somewhere up there. That's where Cantonese belongs. But Burbai is not there. Right now we're suspecting a contact event happened to Burbai because it has deviated more than the rest of Cantonese has. We are glaringly suspecting a contact event for some Mandarin, aren't we? Those guys up there, you can't even see Wutun, who's disappeared into the next hall. But it is quite clear that Urumqi, Hezhou, Gango, which are all spoken in the western part of China, have undergone significant contact. Tangwan is spoken in the north of China. It's undergone significant contact. We're suspecting from this diagram. Just for the sake of completeness, these are the Min languages, originally from southern Fujian. Those Suishi and Xuwen are in Guangdong on the Leizhou Peninsula. These three are nominally Min languages, but they're spoken by ethnically non-Chinese people who've acquired them. Yes.
I just wonder whether you could say a few words about the data that drives this classification. Morphosyntax, what does it mean in this case?
Morphosyntax, our discussion yesterday is let's try and not select the right features to get the right results. So this is morphosyntax coded up roughly according to the morphosyntax present in the Walls Atlas. So take the set of features in Walls, exclude the phonology, exclude the lexical stuff, those kinds of features, recoded to be binary. So instead of having 4 or 5 categorical features, 2 or 3 categorical places, things were split up to become binary. So all in all, that results in about 280 odd features. These are not selected to draw out distinctions in Chinese dialects. These are simply the same set of features that later you'll see generating images in Europe and in the Pacific. So they are not selected by me as independent and objective as we could arrive at. They rather nicely pull out most of the Min subgroup together. So there is a Min morphosyntax. You rather nicely see Nado and Linghua and Zun, part of that group but different. They're showing a Min-style morphosyntax, but they're off in a strange direction. We don't have data from Dai-Kadai and from Mien languages here, so you can't see that they're heading in that direction. But you can strongly suspect that something has happened to Nado. We also have the Hakka languages, which are a bit dispersed. Lufeng is a bit further out. And Gan languages, which appear not to have a coherent typology. And a couple of others as well. That's the big point, though, is the right-hand side of the screen, where you can see that those languages clearly are not behaving as they should. Chinese languages show that level of variation. We empirically attest by looking at how much variation they have. Urumqi is showing too much deviation from the norm. Hezhou and Gango too much. Wutun even more. Tangwan more. We know that Xi'an a bit, but Urumqi and Hezhou have been influenced by Uyghur and other Turkic languages. We know that Tangwan is influenced by Manchu and other Tungusic languages. And we know that off the screen, Wutun is classified in China as a Mandarin variety because of its lexicon. And Yan Hunan, who wrote the description of it, says, look, there's as much Tibetan and Mongolian in as there is Chinese, so who knows? Should we classify it, those languages on the right, should we classify them as Chinese? This is kind of the question of where does Haitian Creole fit within Romance? Lexically, they fit very well because they have a lot of Mandarin lexicon. In terms of the grammar, they really do not fit. They're contact languages of a sort that maybe we want to call them mixed languages. Maybe we want to, I don't know what we want to. But we should not just say, yes, you're Chinese, no, you're not Chinese. We should say that there's a complex history here. And different parts of the language give us a different story. The fact that those languages there are overwhelmingly populated with Chinese words is pretty good evidence that Chinese was highly culturally influential, Mandarin Chinese to be specific. The fact that those languages are morphosyntactically overwhelmingly not like Chinese is pretty good evidence that there has been a linguistic ecology at play that was stronger than the linguistic ecology of Mandarin Chinese. The point is not that we know exactly what happened, but we know enough to suspect that something happened. without knowing the history, without knowing the geography, except for two people, without knowing which was prestigious one place or another, we know just looking at this that some event happened over there. And down here, Burbai has had contact with something. It's been dragged not out of the world of Chinese, but out of the world of Cantonese. It's looking more like this Dun language, more like Danzhou for that matter. And Danzhou is an isolate within Chinese, so who knows what's going on there. The other point is, if we simply threw all the data together, we wouldn't be able to tease this out. So the languages marked in blue are marked in blue because they're classified as Mandarin. They're classified as Mandarin because they show good lexical features of Mandarin. Their third singular pronoun is cognate with Mandarin's third singular pronoun, etc., etc., etc. There are good reasons to classify them as Mandarin. If we simply threw it all together, we wouldn't tease out the fact that all those languages on the right are unambiguously Mandarin from one perspective, and unambiguously not Mandarin from another perspective, not even Chinese from another perspective. We want those perspectives. Recall that the aim of this is not to have a look at how Chinese is working, or how Tamangek and Tibetan were working, but to be able to come up with a methodology for inferring past contact scenarios from modern data. So this, I repeat again, this diagram was created in Splitstree without the use of any geographic information. It was purely language structure. And boy, finding linguistic descriptions of Chinese varieties, good luck with that, not easy. But based purely on language data, we create a topography of similarity. And that topography of similarity shows us that some languages are not behaving. Let's have a look at what happens when we look at different kinds of data. In fact, actually we'll just look at morphosyntax. Here's a sample of, I think it's 20 languages of Europe. When I do that to them, I look at the morphosyntax, the same set of features that we examined for Chinese. This is the resulting tree for those, call it 20, I'm not going to count them, languages of Europe, excluding Basque, because we're trying to be neat and clean. Does anyone have any organizing principles they can spot in this diagram?
Some groups, we can see some groups there.
The first impression is it's matching Indo-European subgroups well. You see a nice Celtic group over there, containing all and only Celtic languages. You can see a nice Germanic group there, all and only Germanic. There's some Balto-Slavic. Down there we've got some Romance. And here we've got the Balkans, that well-known subgroup. So yes, there's a Sprachbund there, there's areality. Now let's go back and re-examine those lovely European subgroups, since we know that areality can play a role. How many languages are spoken in the Celtic part of the world, other than Celtic? My point being that we can geographically define this branch. Not this branch of Indo-European, but this branch of this tree. The Germanic languages are a nice group of north. There's those guys. Romance is looking good there. The east is nicely Balto-Slavic. It all works out. And these Balkans languages belong to multiple subgroups, but they are also areally defined. So the impression we got of this diagram showing subgroups of Indo-European, I think we can better explain it by saying it shows regions of Europe. And it happens, which is not surprising, that the subgroups of Indo-European, with the exception of Romania, form geographically coherent groups. That's what you should expect. As languages split and diversify, all else being equal, they'll split into adjacent territory.
Can you go back? Just to have a look at that under this.
Yeah. So what we are seeing is a very distinct Celtic group. That's verb initial order. We're seeing a surprisingly distinct Germanic group. Balto-Slavic is looking good. Romance is a bit diverse, but it's still a coherent branch. But then Romanian, Greek, Albanian, Bulgarian liminally, but certainly Romanian, Albanian, Greek, we're detecting without reference to any known volcanisms. I repeat that. The data sets used to generate this made no reference to the literature on Balkan Trachtenbund. It's simply, here's a bunch of morphosyntactic features taken from walls.
On the other hand, we have some problem with English, which are geographically nearer to Celtic group more than other German languages, but it is not the nearest German language to this subgroup.
Yeah. I mean, really, all of those Germanic languages are equidistant, really, to Celtic. There's not a lot of difference in there. The important part is this coherent branch separating them from the main mass in the middle. Yes, it's not perfect. It's far from perfect. But it's a methodology which seems to be a decent way to detect areas. All it's doing is detecting areas, but recall, without any geographic information. Since this is linguistic information, that means we're detecting the reality. Okay, I'll bounce back through those pretty colours again. Now, if we were to look at sound systems, which I'm not going to show for Europe at the moment, we get a different picture. And we will have a look at a different picture with the same data in a second. Usually, definitions of linguistic areas refer to sounds. Balkans people have referred to a schwa, but really much less than other definitions of linguistic areas have. And if languages, as they disappear, retain phonology of an earlier language, since it's the mothers speaking the language, then that could be very interesting. Big point, different histories, keep them separate. So, recall, Malayo-Sumbawa, we return to the Pacific. This is a nice test case because Malayo-Sumbawan is a well-established subgroup of Malayo-Polynesian, which is the Austronesians out of Taiwan. Also, a number of these languages have been very politically important in the area. This study looks at 23 languages from Indonesia. They're all part of the Malayo-Sumbawan group, and their locations and their affiliations are here. So all of these are Malayic varieties. The yellow ones are Chamic languages, Balinese, Sumbawa, Sasak, Sundanese, and Madurese. That's how they're distributed on the map of Indonesia. Once again, the very right edge of this map is hiding off screen, and I apologize for that. All it shows further to the right is one more Malayic language, Papuan Malay. So, 23 languages, all from the same Malayo-Sumbawan group, but radically dispersed across Indonesia, from Thailand and China, in fact, out to the far eastern edge of Indonesia. If I do the same, let's make a morphosyntax diagram for them, I get one picture. We won't look at it in great detail. The important point is, if I do the same thing for phonology, I get a different picture. Phonology gives you one story, morphosyntax gives you another. The two of them together are not the same. So Mualang is roughly an isolate in morphosyntax, and it's disappeared up there. Oh, there it is. Mualang's hiding near Mentawai, Malay, and Tat. Similarly, Urak Lamoy is over there, whereas here, Urak Lamoy, actually fairly coherent. Mapping it helps you understand it better. The phonological clustering results in these. These dots are now coloured not according to their subgroup, but they're coloured according to where they fell in the phonological clustering. So the Chamic languages are Sat, two Chamic varieties, and Achinese. They form a subgroup. But in phonological terms, they don't, because Achinese is part of this group, the red group. Similarly, Urak Lamoy and Nontaburim Malay are not part of the Chamic subgroup, but phonologically they're behaving like that. Can you think of any reason why these 5 languages came out in the same phonological subgroup? Is there any hint on the map that may tell you why they're grouping together, even though they come from different subgroups of Malayo-Sumbawan? We have some Malayic languages, some Chamic languages. They belong to different subgroups. Phonologically, they're forming a coherent cluster. Why might that be?
But they are located close
And
to.
geographically adjacent.
There's a lot of languages here, there's others, never mind. But yes, they're effectively adjacent. They're located on the mainland. They've come under the influence of mainland Southeast Asian typologies. Aerial contact has affected them away from whatever is normal, off in that direction. We see Malayalam is also in there. There's a bit of random noise everywhere. Otherwise, Madurese is very distinct, and then there's a massive red, kind of. And Kerinchi and Panama are behaving badly. Morphosyntactically, we see a different picture. Just have a look at the yellow for the moment. Yellow is staying the same, but here's Achinese changing colours, and you can see a lot of other colour changes, including in morphosyntax, a blue region developing in the east, which was not present in the phonology. Looking at the phonology, looking at the morphosyntax, different stories.
Can we combine them?
We will soon after we combine them more. If I look just at the Malay languages, that was the distribution of the Malay languages phonologically. That's what they look like morphosyntactically. The point is, it's the same. You get geographically defined regions based on the morphosyntax, even within subgroups. Now, to properly understand it, you need to have more comparisons. So we added in more Austronesian languages and more languages from different subgroups in the same area to get an idea of what's dragging the languages where. And when you do the phonological clustering, you get a very spiky diagram, which with language labels added, coloured according to family, looks like this. We're not going to dwell on it. The point is, there are clusters. We can see that this down here is different from that there, and there's an awful lot of mess, but there are some sharp breaks as well. If I do it with morphosyntax, the walls features, again, spiky diagram, but different spiky diagram, labels, fine. The maps is where you can interpret this. So these are the languages we looked at first, the 23 Malayo-Sumbawan languages. Then we added in the lighter coloured blue is more Austronesian, red is Papuan, yellow circle is, we looked at those before, green the various mainland Asian families, and there's a couple of Australians who would like. This is coloured by language family and slightly by language subgroup. Again, recall, yellow circle means it's one of those Malayo-Sumbawan languages. They form a subgroup of Austronesian. All the yellow ones are a coherent subgroup together. When we cluster according to phonology, these are the clusters that emerge. Does anyone want to explain one colour?
We just want to ask the red, I mean, on the Papua, the red is the same red as the left, or it's orange on the south? Yeah.
That's actually the same.
So
Yeah.
And the light green that is like one point there and the other point on.
The light green is meant to be light green in both. Explain a colour at 80% accuracy, let's say. You don't have to be 100%. Can you explain any one colour with some level of accuracy?
green.
The green is the glaring one, right? You can cover 90% of the green by saying, I'm on mainland Asia. And if we know anything about the languages of Southeast Asia, we know that they're talking short words, not a lot of liquids, possibly some tone, lots of vowels. That's what they're behaving like. The big point is to notice that these languages are behaving just like mainland Southeast Asian languages, phonologically. We know that those ones with the yellow rings are Malayo-Sumbawan. Genealogically, that language is close to that language. Phonologically, 1, 2, 3 plus such makes 4. Those languages are mainland Southeast Asia, indistinguishable phonologically from their mainland Southeast Asian neighbours. We think about the happy romance story of the red and the blue people earlier. since the Austronesians do not originate from mainland Southeast Asia, we have to assume that sometime in the past, when Austronesians arrived there, they mixed with local persons and the phonology of mainland Southeast Asia came through in the resulting languages. In other words, we probably saw male Austronesians marrying female mainland Southeast Asians, and that female transmitted mainland Southeast Asian phonology dominated. Red is kind of your default category, and there's a second default of brown here, but it's a bit messy. Keeping that in mind, this is what happens when we classify morphosyntax. Again, quickly look for the circles with yellow around them. And you notice that, again, we are not seeing anything resembling Malayo-Sumbawan coming out in the colours of the dots. Again, we see that green, mainland Southeast Asia and green are going together. Okay, that wasn't an accident. I chose the colours to make them coherent. We see that there are more green patches out here. Now, what do we know of mainland Southeast Asian morphosyntax?
It's very scarce.
It's pretty much the isolating part of the planet. If you construct a map of languages according to do you have agreement and do you have case marking, the only part of the world where not having either is acceptable is up there. And we see the same pattern occurring a little bit out here. We know mainland Southeast Asia is a hotbed of language contact. We would start to suspect these languages, some Malayo-Sumbawan, some not, some Austronesian, some Papuan, as also being the isolating end product of language contact.
Can it be that they are really like the standard Indonesian influences there? Because it is similar.
There's Indonesian.
But where is the border of Indonesia?
Indonesia runs from here to here.
So can it be that these green, dark green circles, they just they have an influence from standard Indonesian?
And that's what standard Indonesian looks like.
Ah, okay. I see that.
So there is clearly a, let's say, southwest Indonesian phonological type in blue, also found up there. Also, I hope someone is noticing, scarily similar to that southwest to north distribution we've been seeing in maps again and again. Amount of Austronesian lexicon, degree of regularity of reflexes, all maps out. Out here we get a mess. There's clearly red morphosyntax is closer to New Guinea. Nobody past here has red morphosyntax. But it's not exclusive in New Guinea. Here's a fairly isolating language right in the middle. And there's another yellow typology that emerges just to the west of New Guinea. Yellow is only between here and here. So we've got a mainland morphosyntactic typology in green, a western Indonesian typology in blue. The green reappears in the middle of yellow and then red takes over, including Australia.
There was a misbehaving language in the middle of Borneo.
Yeah, Mualam. Mualam phonologically doesn't behave very well.
I thought there was a map of morphosyntax before that when we looked on the Malay.
Yeah, and it was similarly misbehaving. Yeah. So we don't know what happened in Mualam's history, but we start to suspect something interesting happened. Again, we're seeking ways to suspect complicated social scenarios in the past.
But it's look like the Papua New Guinean cluster and the Polynesian cluster is more visible in the morphosyntax than in phonology.
Yeah.
And I want to say that the yellow and green dots, it seemed like to be in between, in the in contact zone. So maybe this is maybe this is just morphosyntactical properties of languages being in contact with others. No.
You see this methodology being developed right here. This stuff makes sense, doesn't it?
But
I agree with you completely.
But
I mean, we could quite clearly say, I think, to paraphrase, But this is a coherent linguistic type. This is a coherent linguistic type. And green represents something complicated has happened and you're heading isolating. Yellow is there's contact in your past and you've headed in another direction. Something like that. I agree.
It's interesting what is precisely this yellow morphism.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah. We know green is lack of lots of morphology. Red is essentially verb final and head marking. Blue is whatever Austronesian does best. And yellow is intriguing. Now, the other point you raised, which is really important, is on this map we can see regions more clearly than if I look at the phonology map. The phonology map, we can identify where green was with a high level of certainty, and then it was a bit of a mess. What results in a phonological substrate? Very frequently, a phonological substrate is the result of a language vanishing, but some of its phonology being transmitted on. We almost expect the phonology map to be messier, because there is more chance of phonological material surviving longer as it's being transmitted, regardless of the change of lexicon and the change of syntax in the community-dominant language. So to quickly draw some lines, which will just repeat what we've discussed, we can describe some rough phonological areas, and then we can describe some rough morphosyntax areas on top of them. They don't match up perfectly. In yellow, the Malayo-Sumbawan languages are anywhere you want them to be. Genealogy is not giving us a typological signal in this part of the world. Just looking at the Malay varieties, not Malayo-Sumbawan, not Malayo-Chamic, but just Malay, we can see a couple of languages which are on mainland Southeast Asia. Urat Lamoit is in Thailand on the west coast. Montaburi is just northern Bangkok. And they look like mainland Southeast Asian languages. You cannot typologically spot them as Malay. How and why then do we classify them as Malayic languages?
By means of that.
The lexicon is looking good. The very name Urat Lamoit is Indonesian Orang Laut with a couple of sound changes added to it. Indonesian, Jambi Malay, Kerinci, Mualam from the Orchid language from central Borneo, and Iban from the west coast, they're showing similar clusterings for morphosyntax and phonology. And as we head east, we get an eastern typology in both morphosyntax and phonology. Importantly, we never included geographic information to create this. These geographic labels were emergent categories that came out when we examined linguistic data. Now, why did I show you this and why are we looking at Malayic? It's because we know that all of those yellow languages spread in the last 400 years. We have written records of Malayic varieties spreading from here and being set up in the east and, for that matter, in the west. We know when this happened. We know that of these two options, maybe Malayic languages spread as Malay became a trading language, and lots of Malay people moved, and that's why we get to Malay colonies. Or Malayic languages spread with trading influence, and rather than Malay speakers moving, we see local people taking up the use of this new language. We know that that's what happened. We know that the fact that the Malay languages are reflecting the typology of whatever languages they're surrounded in is a result not of Malay migrating en masse, but a small prestigious group arriving, and because knowledge of Malay allows you to participate in the trade and become rich, people take it up. But they take it up with influence from their local languages. They're all Malayic languages because of their lexicon. But even in the lexicon you find awkward parts of the grammars. Famously, Malay and Indonesian dialects show 85% similarity in words, and the ones that aren't the same are your pronouns, your time reference, and your negation, and your aspect marking. All the things you need to actually understand what anyone says, plus different typology. So, as I said, those areas were areas that just emerged from the analysis. Another thing we can do, predictive areal typology, developed by Balthazar Bickles and Johanna Nichols, is to define a region on some non-linguistic grounds and then examine the distribution of properties in it. One controversial approach is to take the biggest genetic sampling we know from East Asia. And all of those languages were then assigned Altaic, Sino-Tibetan, Tai-Kadai, or Green Austronesian factors as part of their SNP DNA. The ones relevant to us for the part of the world we've just been looking at are groups H, I, and K, which have that distribution. H, I, and K are not coherent linguistic entities, they're not coherent social regions, but they are showing some human genetic coherence. Ignore. Big point is, we can find linguistic traits corresponding to those genetically defined regions. So H, which is the green there, have a gap for a J and a G. They have ba and da, but no ja and ga. They allow initial velar nasals. Modifiers follow the nouns. The large blue area, languages in that area, regardless of what family they're in, though they are mostly Austronesians, have applicatives, have initial WH words. The red, which extends across Melanesia, you can read the stuff there. The big point is we can make all these linguistic characterizations on the basis of ancient DNA. Recall on Monday that the list of things we can characterize the Austronesian family as having is none. Austronesian as a genealogical entity gives us less signal than human genetic material, which is awkward. So, the next thing, and the thing we're going to finish on, is let's just see what emerges from the data. In the maps that I showed you, which we examined, we took data, performed clustering analysis, took the branches of those clusters and mapped them. Advantages to that technique. We're being very empirical about areality. We're not assuming anything. We're not saying measure here versus measure there. We are simply saying, if I take the data, what clusters emerge in terms of families, let's map those and see if there's any areal continuity. And as you observe, the morphosyntax shows a stronger areal signal than the phonology does. This is a good observation that we can make. But it makes categorical assumptions. We're saying this language should fit there and should fit there. A better approach would be to evaluate how distant it was and code them according to similarity, not according to absolute category. So we took a whole lot of data. This is myself and my collaborator Siva Kalyana. We took data sets similar to what we've described, 290, 300 odd features. Obviously not every feature was independent, so we did multidimensional scaling on it. So instead of having 290 easy to define features, we ended up with less features, less dimensions. 5 turns out to be the number of dimensions of variation that best accounts for the data, but very complex descriptions for those dimensions. You'll see some in a moment. Then we reduced everything down to the same scale, so it's something like how many vowels do you have wasn't counting for any more than how many nasals do you have. Typically a language has more vowels than it has nasals, but you want all the features to count the same. Computed distances between them, etc., etc. Only took the first 5 dimensions, since those were the ones that had the biggest impact. This is called a scree plot. It's what you find in this kind of analysis, that one dimension shows a lot of, accounts for a lot of variation, then less, and then very quickly adding more dimensions of variation doesn't work. What are those dimensions of variation? Phonologically, the differences in the phonologies of the language of the world is mostly accounted for by how you're doing with sibilants. Fricatives, affricates, aspirated plosive. High energy noise is the first major dimension of variation in languages around the world. Then after that, how many nasals do you have is a major dimension of variation. Then how many liquids? Dimension 4 is how do you have voiced plosives or you don't? Dimension 5, what about oral stops? All very abstract. There is luckily a lovely visualization tool we can use, brought on by John Nobon in his dialectology. This is a map of Holland, and Belgium, coded according to phonetic differences between lexemes in a word list. The first 3 dimensions of variation, imagine a figure like that. The first 3 dimensions of variation are you red, are you green, are you blue? So the first dimension of variation gets you more red colour. The second dimension gets you more green. The third dimension gets you more blue, which means that these different sample points aren't coloured according to category, but according to distance between the items on the word list. So these are all quite similar, and Groningen is quite similar. And these are similar to here, and yellow is a variant of red in a sense, and that's where it's most different. So the diversity in a word list in Dutch is up here in the northeast. The colours are not categorical, the colours are scales. The colours could be not just that, but anywhere in between. So you could have mixtures between red and yellow to get you orange along the way. When you do this with the phonological database, the first dimension of variation was fricatives, affricates, and aspiration. Do you have them? Don't be red. But if you do have fricatives or affricates, you don't get red colouring. If you do have them, you do get red colouring. Velar nasals and just lots of nasals in general. If you have more velar nasals, you head back towards green. Velar nasals and multiple nasal places. A combination of green and red gets you yellow. Third dimension is liquids, especially Eurasia. A language with liquids gets a blue mixture to its colour. Combination of blue plus green would get you light blue. Combination of blue plus red would get you pink. Combination of red plus yellow plus blue makes you lighter and lighter and lighter. And again, there's intermediate stages and there's also a middle. So this constructs a cube which is coloured according to the position in the cube. When we take the phonology database and apply this analysis to it, that is the structure of phonology in the languages of the world. This is a 3-dimensional cube, and inside it you can see that the edges are not reached, the very vertices are not attested. There's a large cloud of language, but there's an outlier up here. This is an outlier which doesn't have fricatives or aspiration. It's big on nasals and it has lots of liquids. That's the weirdest part of the world phonologically. If we look at this dense cloud from the other side, you can see there's a green extrusion down here. The main body of the cloud is there, but there's a part of the cloud that extends out where we have affricates, where you probably have velar nasals, we're close to the bottom, so not big on liquids. Those are the extremes of variation phonologically around the world. On the one side, I'll go back so you can spell it, I'll go forward. On the one side you've got that little cluster that's not part of the main body. And at the opposite side there's an extension going out farther than you predict from the main body. All of those points are not randomly distributed. That's the first point to make. And this cloud is created only by examining and scaling phonological data. We can perform a clustering analysis on it, and it turns out that 7 clusters best accounts for the data that we have here. But here's the really interesting part. Cluster 1. Cluster 1 is that yellowish one. It's high on dimension 1, which means we don't see fricatives, we don't see affricates, we don't see aspiration. It's high on dimension 2, lots of nasals. High on dimension 3, lots of liquids. Anyone have an idea where that might be? No fricatives, lots of nasals, lots of liquids.
Australia.
That's the distribution of dimension of cluster 1. No geographic information was harmed in the creation of these clusters, and yet we find clusters 1 and cluster 2 are very, very geographically constrained. This second cluster, lots of aspiration, not many liquids, reasonable number of nasals, shows us effectively not even just East Asia, it's really Eastern Mandarin. Clusters 3 and 4 are also geographically coherent. Cluster 3 is the rest of East Asia, POS, and we can see Africa participates in everything. Cluster 4 is the western half of the world. Cluster 5 is the eastern half of the world, and cluster 6 starting to get a bit overly spread out. We're approaching the center of the cloud. It's a bit messy, but the Pacific and the Amazon are kind of coherent. Cluster 7 we won't examine because that's the default elsewhere group. The clusters are hierarchically arranged, and if I show all of those maps together, we have this. East Asia looks coherent as an area. Australia looks coherent. New World, if you squint, it looks coherent. If you look up close, there's a lot of variation from language to language. No one can really make a claim for Africa being coherent phonologically. Everything that's happening is happening there. And then we can see a really interesting fade between East Asia in green. As we approach the purple of South Asia, we have a separate little Himalayan light blue. None of this is genealogical. All of this comes with caveats because there's variation in colours everywhere. But what we're seeing is aerial patterns on a large scale, generated, discovered, without reference to area. These are generated, I'll be posting these slides, generated only through linguistic data. Now, since we're dealing with 2 language families here and 5 or 6 languages families here, all we can do to explain this is to say aeriality, to say something has happened in terms of ancient contact. This has to be very ancient contact because we've got I can see a signal for North and South America. We know North and South America were inhabited 14,000, 15,000 years ago. We are detecting that. We're not detecting a signal here. That's been going on too long. Proof that this is aeriality for those who are thinking that humans can find a pattern in anything if you give them long enough. If we take these same points and the same colours and randomise the distribution, we end up with that. That's what no aeriality looks like. Whereas what we actually see is this. So it's definitely an aerial signal. If I zoom in to the part of the world we've been examining, you can see the green fading out as we head out this way. That mainland Southeast Asian pattern that we detected categorially is present to a limited extent as we head out, and then pretty much here's the end of the green, except maybe blue. And little cropping up there in, what's that called? Yelmet. Well. Australia, we can see a pattern, and it kind of fades towards New Guinea. Categoriality is the wrong way to do it, because in reality, all of these are just points in a cloud of typological space. I'm starting to run over time almost, so I'll speed up a little bit. Clusters, done that. The obvious question, based on your comment earlier.
About clusters?
No, not quite. What was your comment earlier about? You made a very important point.
So I said about the clusters are more visible in morphosyntax phonology.
So here's the morphosyntax one. This is based on less languages, but again you can see the aeriality rather clearly. I won't go through the cluster analysis of it, because it turns out morphosyntax is a very different distribution of phonology. You saw the 3D plot of phonology. It's basically a center with a satellite orbiting it and an extrusion coming down to the bottom left. This is the same points, but now the colors are according to head final versus head initial. Do you have agreement and applicatives or not? Do you have causatives and passives? And what about genitives and numerals? Those are the major correlations with the dimensions that we're looking at. Examples of languages closest to the edges are Tigrinya, New Guinea Highlands up there, Southeast Asia on the right side, Zapotecs down at the bottom, as is Bantu. These are the kind of languages we see. The important point, though, is this is the cluster we're observing. I have no idea what that arrow is doing there. If anyone can offer an explanation, yay. It fits well on this map. That arrow there is showing that beautiful, gentle transition from the mainland to New Guinea. And here's your strange yellow contact zone, showing as a brilliant pink, which now that they're no longer categorical, you can see is really just an extension between red and blue. It's a perfect mixture of that typology and that typology. Mainland Southeast Asia, if I go north, who would feel daring enough to show me the point where it suddenly becomes Chinese and not Southeast Asian? It's just a gentle transition through, even though they're passing through family after family. If I plot up, those are Papuan languages. You can see they're bluer than their surroundings. There's another group of Papuan languages here, which again are bluer. But if we ignore those for the moment, you can't really tell that there's an Austronesian typology out there. In the north, it's very brown. In the southwest, it's reddy orange. Around here, they're very pink, and that survives. But these are Polynesian languages, which are more brown. Micronesia's a bit darker red. It's adapting to the area it's in. Recall also, big point we saw earlier, there are Austronesians on mainland Southeast Asia, and they've gone completely isolating, like their neighbours. When you've completely lost your morphosyntactic profile, if that's where Austronesian starts off being, and we end up being that, you have to wonder about what the most economical explanation is. Did we take a language and completely rework its grammatical and phonological system? Or did we take a language and add some new words? I think it makes a lot more sense to think of, for instance, Tsat as being a local language with Austronesian words added. Luckily for Tsat, we have DNA studies showing that the Tsat people are Daikadai. The Tsat people match the Thai people to their north and west, even though their lexicon is Austronesian. Their phonology is Chinese, and their morphosyntax is generic Southeast Asian. Subgroup boundaries within Austronesian aren't really helpful either, is a short summary. If I look up at the China to Southeast Asia divide, I can't spot it. I can spot recent Tibeto-Burman arrivals in Southeast Asia. These blue and turquoise colours that haven't assimilated. We know that they've been there for the last 200, 300 years, and in those areas we can see typologically that they haven't assimilated. Proof of concept, they haven't been there long enough, and we can see that. But down there are 3 language families in that larger circle. You can't tell them apart. If I look at other parts of the world, we can similarly construct some nice stories. What's going on in New Guinea in detail? That's one family, which happens to be more isolating. So here it detected a genealogical grouping, but it's also one large river valley. Across the highlands, there's a typological profile, and even leaving off the Austronesians, there's a different typology in the Sko languages and the Torricelli languages. Austronesian languages have a typological profile different to New Guinea, but are tested on the south coast where they're closest to New Guinea. So even in this direction, we're seeing transitions happening. That's not Australian, that's still showing an Australian profile. In Africa, we can see Bantu fairly coherent, a rather dramatic break with the southern languages, some beautiful levels of diversity up in western Ethiopia and Nigeria. It's not just the continua, but it's the breaks in the continua, which are really interesting, because they tell us also a social story about non-assimilation.
May I ask a question, since now you mentioned Bantu? Actually, my question emerged when you showed the phonology map. As far as I understand, we can't see any clear evidence of Bantu expansion on the phonology map. Or can we? It's very clear. It's very clear on the syntax map, but it's sort of.
Yeah. So in terms of the explanation I've been trying to put out there, Bantu morphosyntax morphosyntax, I believe Bantu expansion is associated with ironworking. It was a dominant, prestigious culture, language replacement on an epic scale, but there were languages there before. In the phonology, I believe we're seeing the substratal influences of the pre-Bantu languages emerging and surviving, even while the morphosyntax is following the template of Bantu languages everywhere. So, to your point, we have better detection of areality in morphosyntax, but perhaps better detection of ancient substrata in phonology. Perhaps. Read the 2013 paper for more details. As I wrap up, the clusters look like that. We've seen the phonology before. This is typological space for phonology. It's basically a lump with a satellite and an extrusion. Morphosyntax is more like a hollow shell with breaks on the edges. There's a bunch of things in orbit around a void. The structure of morphosyntax is very different. There are a couple of languages dead in the middle, but really very few. Morphosyntax is an eggshell, whereas phonology is like a mushroom. It's just growing and poking out. You can have a look in our last couple of minutes at these maps online, which I will quickly show you because we have a rather beautiful visualization. Perhaps. Hello, thank you. Oh. This stuff is online here in a map that you can play with and drag your way around and examine the world at your pleasure and realize that that was Vietnamese and that should be Tsat, yes. And here's the Austroasiatic languages. And if we pull our way back up to where we are now, you can see a rather lovely climb from European languages fading out on the edge of Europe into Eurasian languages heading there, which then fade into Chinese and fades into Southeast Asia. Very aerial patterns with exceptions. The colours based purely on linguistic data. And the fact that purely linguistic data still generates something that's so easily detectable means that this idea of, in the absence of ethnographic studies, in the presence of only linguistic data, we can make some good hypotheses about ancient contact and ancient aerial influences on languages. And in terms of the Pacific story I've been narrating out here, I think what we're observing is a lot of language shift, a lot of relexification, and much less regular intergenerational language transmission than has been assumed by people who draw family trees. And with that, the end. Thank you.
I have two questions. The first is, on these net maps, if we take the data about both morphosynthesis and phonetics, would it give us more information about possible contexts?
So if you combine them, you lose the fact that you have different pictures. So, and I think it's really important not to do that. If we combine them, and of course we experimented with that to see what would happen, because who doesn't want to create a better story? If you combine these two together, eventually, what emerges is kind of like the morphosyntax map, but with less clear boundaries. So adding these two together, and they have roughly equal numbers of features, that roughly replicates this map. If you think about what I said about the structure of morphosyntactic space and the structure of phonological space, phonology tends towards a lump with a couple of extrusions. Morphosyntax is dispersed in space. There's nothing much in the center of the morphosyntactic space. So the morphosyntax is more different than the phonology. So when you combine them, rather than getting a clearer story, you get a muckier story. It's not what you'd expect to find, but that's what happens. And I think it's because they give us different signals. The phonology gives us old substratal stuff, the morphosyntax gives us adstratal stuff. So keeping them separate, and keeping them separate from lexical material, and sound change material, because that definitely gives us a story, is good. I said earlier that this is a crude typology. Really, we don't want to do this. Really, we want to look at how the noun phrases work compared to how the verb phrases work. We want to look at agreement or word order separate from gender. We want to separate things out and see how many different stories we can get. The proof of concept, though, is that without being sophisticated, we still get really good results. By simply throwing all the morphosyntactic data in together, I mean, oh, hello Pacific Northwest in red, bang, right there. Without any features being selected to try and detect what's known about the Pacific Northwest.
So I was wondering, in this area, does it make sense to talk about a language as belonging to just one family, or do you think we can talk about a language as sort of, especially the Austronesian languages, as belonging to several families simultaneously? And if you want to say that one language is Austronesian, then how can you decide whether you should base that on phonology or lexicon or syntax?
So the question is essentially, should we privilege one source of data over another when describing a language? It's like imagining an Indo-European language with both tone and retrofix consonants. That's clearly crazy. We should never call them Indo-European, except when Norwegian and Swedish come along. So something's going on up there. I think if we were going to say, is Norwegian Indo-European? Yes, it is. But there's a little bit of something else lurking in it. I think for these Austronesians, we'll say, yes, you're Austronesian to this degree in this manner. And the languages that are here are definitely Southeast Asian. And the pink ones are the curious ones because they're not really blue and they're not really red. At that point, I suspect, like the data I showed you that Owen analysed on Tuesday, that there's something which has now completely disappeared and we have no name for it. But it's my opinion that we shouldn't use a single noun to describe a language in the affiliation.
I have a question to the simpler map that was mentioned about morphology and syntax, like in the equilibrium. So there was like 3 or 4 morphological groups, right? Like this map with the tiles, like terrain, it's not really important. Yeah, this one, for example. So we see here like more or less clear-cut groups, right? Mm-hmm. Based on the data about all of the isoglosses, morphological isoglosses.
And syntactic as well.
Yeah. So my question is, certain as I'm certain, how much data does this grouping explain? So what percent of, how many isoglosses do not generally match this grouping?
Yeah,
so did you investigate it? So it's like more than 95% or...
So this goes to the question, as I said, this is a crude way of doing it. In reality, not every single feature has its own isogloss, but many are lined together as well. This is based on this clustering diagram, and we can see that there's a lot of intermediate cases in reality. There's a clear left versus right, but assigning by to any particular cluster is fairly arbitrary. Ideally, we wouldn't look at morphosyntax as a single group, but we'd find logically coherent subgroups. I think that would be better. How much data do these clusters explain? I don't know is the short answer.
But presumably, so you checked it, so more than 80% or like...
Yeah, this is the best clustering analysis we can get for it. Some of the data then becomes noise. It's the data that's not showing a coherent, co-occurrent signal with other bits of data in the data set. So if, for instance, we're verb final and we have postpositions, that data will be starting to be privileged over are you genitive noun or noun genitive. Genitive noun and noun genitive is attested almost everywhere, but verb final and postpositions isn't attested there, so some data which maximally co-occurs ends up maximally influencing the choice of clusters.
And my last small question, did you look into this data that doesn't match the isoglosses, the features, that do not match that. Maybe they are from the same group.
I have spent far too much time looking at maps of individual features and making notes and then losing those notes about that's interesting. There's a lot of individual stories there as well.
What's about Wool's information being, well, incoherent about different languages, but you don't get the same data points for all languages, and you can't intersect it.
So this was based on Wool's features, but it was extensively recoded.
Yeah, I mean that
And
for quite a lot of languages you get too few data points.
yeah, so they were, when I started creating this database, I began with the Wool's database, and I threw out 3/4 of the languages because there was not enough data points. And since then I backfilled a lot and added in 1,000 other languages. So yes, the Wool's data as it is fine, but most of it is too poorly attested. All of the morphosyntax database excluded anything from Wool's that was phonological and anything that was lexical. And there's a lot of, given that feature, this cannot possibly be true, so that was reconciled along the way as well. You're dependent marking, but you have no case. You could do a whole talk on the process of constructing a database, which would be not that exciting to most of us, myself included.
How is the division of this cluster into different colors made automatically?
Yeah, it was on the basis of this clustering diagram plus factor analysis on which languages best fit given a however many cluster solution. Again, I think this is not the best way to do it. The gradual transition is far and away the better visualization.
Yeah, so I want to say about maybe we can change the size of colors of these parts of and
so we could do better by having finer degrees of color differentiation here rather than these crude ones. That would be better. And effectively, that's what we produced when we didn't try to make categories, but simply said, here's where the data leads us to. That's effectively what this comes out as. It still doesn't address the problem of we're losing some information as we go here, but I think this isn't the map I was aiming for. That's the map I was aiming for. This is a much better way to do it, I think. We can still detect areality, but we're much more honestly acknowledging the fact that it isn't quite so clear-cut as we move around.
Can you go back to the slide with the clouds, the morphosyntactic ones? There was a lot of breaks in between the clusters, and does this mean, can we deduce some universals from these breaks?
Yes. Also note that the very edges are not attested. So logically it would be possible, for instance in phonology, to have a language without aspiration and with lots of nasals but no liquids. It's a logical possibility, but it's not attested. Somewhere out there, there's a universal saying that as you get nasals, you acquire liquids. Why? No idea. No good reason. We have languages with lots of nasals, we have languages with lots of liquids, we have lots of nasals, lots of liquids, no aspiration. We attest all the extremes, but there are combinations which are unattested. In morphosyntax, it's more dispersed, there's more space in between. But even here, there's actually very few languages in between Australia and the rest. There's very little in there, but there are in-betweens lurking between the clusters here as well. And there's a whole lot that are on this side of blue and that side of green on the other side, which show phonologies which really shouldn't be attested. Beautifully ironically, the least likely language on the planet turns out to be the most widely spoken one, Mandarin Chinese. It's the one you least predict from anyone else. So, but there's a lot that needs to be done on the geometry of typological space. And what I find most interesting is this avoidance of the center for morphosyntax, whereas phonology is sticking from the center. Morphosyntax comes in, phonology goes out. Except for Australia, which shouldn't be there.
Yeah, maybe just related to that. Remember, the Adams one suggested that this may have to do with some deficiency in hearing certain frequencies.
There have been some clinical audiologists who suggested that chronic infections resulted in the inability to hear high-frequency noise, particularly the sort of noise associated with fricatives and aspiration. It doesn't explain the correlation between nasals and liquids. And the correlation between nasals and liquids is quite low for the rest of the world, but in Australia they really correlate well. From the number of nasals, you can predict at 50% success rate the number of liquids. In the rest of the world, you've got a 10% success rate. So something else has just developed in Australia which cannot be clinically explained. The big point of these clusters is language universals don't exist. What happens here in terms of this predicts that or this correlates with that isn't the same as what happens here. There are local norms, and those norms are defined on purely language data typological grounds, but they end up corresponding to geographic regions rather dramatically, as we've seen, with fuzzy edges. But within each of those areas, there are different norms for how languages should behave. And knowing how Chinese works does not tell you how Australian works at all. For instance, just to choose the extremes in phonology. Okay, so a bit more on this tomorrow as well. Thank you.